Welcome to Pulp Herb Reads Things. I'm Herb. This video is my promised video on Bradbury reading. For those who aren't familiar with Ray Bradbury, he was one of the more interesting science fiction writers of the mid-20th century. He's probably most remembered for his novel Fahrenheit 451. Which is fair, and he has very interesting stories about how that was a dime novel. He wrote it a dime at a time on a typewriter at a University of California library where you paid a dime to use the typewriter and the time ran out and you had to put another dime. He also wrote The Martian Chronicles, Something Wicked This Way Comes as a short story, a novel, and as a script. He wrote the script for John Huston's movie of Moby Dick, and a variety of other things. He, like many authors, wrote a book on writing called Zen and the Art of Writing. In 2001, he gave a talk at Point Loma Nazarene University in California about being a writer. And the first part was on hygiene as a writer. And by hygiene, he didn't mean washing behind your ears or brushing your teeth. Well, I'm sure he thinks those are important. He meant the habits of mind and of writing and reading a writer needed. The most famous, and this is the part that is alluded to in Zen and the Art of Writing, as well as by many other authors I know, I'm not even sure this is original to Ray, is the idea that for a year, a new writer should write a short story a week. The idea behind that being you can't write 52 bad stories in a row. Eventually, you'll write a good one. But for our purposes today, the more interesting thing he told young writers to do was every day before you go to bed, read a story, an essay, and a poem. I have always assumed story means short story because he's talking about in the evening. He says before you go to bed. A lot of people have interpreted that as the last thing you do in your day, so it feeds your subconscious at night. In following this practice, I've been a little more liberal, but I do tend to read them after the workday. If you're one of those amazing people who could read Gone with the Wind between dinner and bedtime, feel free to go through a bunch of large novels. Mere mortals like myself, though, I will stick with things like the current Garbology anthology, or actually last year's Garbology anthology, and year's best science fiction, single author collections, that kind of thing. I've been engaged in this practice for the better part of a decade. One of the more interesting things I've learned is if I fall off, my writing falls off not long after, and if I get back in the saddle after a delay, my writing really starts to pick up. So clearly it's good for writers. But what about readers? This is a booktube channel. I'm not aiming at writers, I'm aiming at the people who read what other people write. Often the same group, don't get me wrong. But why do I think your average reader would benefit by adopting this structure into their reading? I think the easiest way to explain it is this is one of the most efficient ways to increase your aperture to the world. For those who haven't done a lot with optics, the simple definition of an aperture, it is the hole in an optical instrument that emits light from the outside world. The larger your aperture, the more you can see. Sometimes you can see a wider space. Sometimes you can see further. Very large telescopes that we use to peer very far out have very large apertures because the larger your aperture, the more light you can collect. I'm sure there are people who are experts in photography and telescopes and a lot of other parts of optics who are cringing right now. Have at it in the comments after we finish with the video. Reading in general is a way to increase the size of your aperture. If I read Garbology, there's a story that used the term dogging, and somebody on the Discord said they hadn't learned the term until that book. For those who don't know, it's a slang term that refers to a prurient practice. You can look it up. It's not the point. Apparently it's a very English term, although as an American I know before the story. But you learn that. Now let's apply that to something a little deeper. If you are interested in the First World War and what that experience was like for soldiers in it, and you were born in 1966 or 76 or 96, over 50 years after the war began, you could do a lot worse than to read Robert Graves' Goodbye to All of That, which in part is a memoir of him being in the trenches of the war. If you have never considered why somebody right of center thinks what they do, you could read Barry Goldwater's The Conscience of a Conservative. Similarly, if you haven't considered what somebody left of center might think about things, you might read Pinsky's recent book, Capital. I don't think anybody disputes that reading is a way to increase your aperture. But what the Bradbury reading does is it makes concise bites that you consume on a regular basis. You are going to have to find a lot of stories, a lot of essays, and a lot of poems to get 365. Now, Bradbury suggested you do this for 1,000 days. I have not done 1,000 straight. My best streak has been 176. And a good year for me is between 250 and 300. But let's look at somebody who's disciplined enough to do 365 in a typical year. All of Shakespeare's sonnets are less than a third of the poems you need. All of Shakespeare's sonnets. That's a lot of poetry, and it's only a third of what you need. It's actually probably closer to a quarter. The year's best collections tend to have 15 to 25 stories or essays, depending on the editor and which particular year's best line. But let's consider there is a world's best science fiction, fantasy, murder and suspense, crime writing, sports writing, general short stories, and essays from one company. Although I think they've cut some of those from the line, but there was a company I was using a lot early on. So that's what, 6 regular books? Even if you look at the maximum, 25, it's 150. That's still less than half of the stories you need. And if you're picking out a year's best anthology, except for essays, which I have noticed tend to be, in the United States at least, whatever the New York publishing industry was hyper-focused on that year. So, for example, when the 2021s came out in 2021, there was pretty much nothing in the year's best essays that concerned anything before the death of George Floyd. And they all concerned George Floyd or COVID, even though other things happened that year. Still, the sports writing is broader, the crime writing is broader, the short stories are all over, and even the essays can be all over unless there's something that dominated the year. If you follow this and you use those best of collections and a couple of supplementary ones, go to a different publisher and get a sci-fi fantasy one which might have 60 stories, you're going to cover a lot more than your normal everyday exposure by looking at, these are the genres I like to read, these are the authors I like, these are the magazines I consume, because they're drawn from a broader collection. And you cannot avoid your aperture being larger. And I'm not even saying this will bring some grand, thoughtful change. You won't become a revolutionary or become the next greatest scientist. But let's consider something. I am in my late 50s. I was born in a Navy family, and my father got out of the military when I was very young. And I grew up in the mountain states of the United States. You probably have an idea of my interest in knowledge based on that. That isn't unfair. You can say, well, he was probably exposed to this This is what American schools, especially in those regions, were teaching in that time. So you have a pretty good idea of my baseline knowledge and interests. But I doubt you expected me to be so fascinated by the Belle Epic era of France that when I found out a new computer RPG, a type of computer game I not only generally don't play, but have a deep distaste for because they become so common that RPG means them instead of the traditional pen and paper ones that I love to play. But I'm considering buying one called Expedition 33, in large part because its style and its imagery are based upon that epic of French history. Why do I have that particular interest? Because I have read pretty much every short story by Guy de Maupassant, who wrote about that in the earlier Third Empire era, and I have been entranced by almost all of them. Bolet de Souffle, pardon my French pronunciations, it's probably off, Ball of Fat, may be my favorite short story of all time. Similarly, from essays, I have seen and gained empathy for people who won the lottery and still end up going on a crime spree, and lost empathy for people who committed what I thought were understandable crimes from the essays in a year's best crime series. I'm not saying this is the only way to increase your aperture. I'm not even saying it's the best. I wanted to go to St. John's University when I first got out of high school in the United States, which is a great books program. I have all of it printed out. I have all the books of the Greek here, and I keep saying I'm going to read them, and I've done a little bit, but I haven't finished it. I would love to gain a classical education. I have multiple guides for getting one as an adult. They're hard. They are not efficient. Reading the Odyssey in 2 weeks and talking about it intelligently with 5 other people who are also reading at the same pace is a luxury I would have had at 19. I do not have it at 58 with a full-time job. But I do have the time and luxury of reading a short story, a poem, and an essay every evening. Especially once you're in the groove, because most short stories can be read in 15 minutes to half an hour. And that gets you up to 12,000 words. They're readily available in the library and collections and so on. And that's why I want to encourage everyone, or add this practice, and do it until it becomes a habit, honored less in the breach than in the action. I used to tell people I chose to believe Elvis and Jim Morrison faked their deaths. And if asked why, and I also claim that they were the great songwriters of the last quarter of the 20th century, just nobody knew it. But I've been asked why. My answer has always been because that is a more interesting world than one where that's not true. And I'd say about 10 years ago, I quit saying that. And I think Bradbury Reading is part of it because it gave me the ability to widen my aperture, as I've said, in an efficient and relatively quick way, to the point where the world I'm in is a lot more interesting than thinking dead celebrities are still alive. Although they do make fun short stories such as Sarah Hoyt's Elvis Died for Your Sins, which if you have a chance, I would advise looking up. And yes, I originally read that as a Bradbury short story. Bradbury Reading short story. Obviously, Sarah Hoyt wrote it. So that's all I want to talk about with reading and books today. I will put a link to the Bradbury talk. I won't put timestamps in because it's all within the first 10 minutes, and I think that's worth listening to anyway. And I will see you Monday with my results from the first week of Garb August. Remember to like and subscribe. Thank you, and have a good night.